Hey guys, lovely to know that all of you are going to find this subject really interesting as much as I'm going to be. I think everybody knows me on here. For those that don't, that will listen to this recording, my name's Lister. I run a company called Studio 17 Pilates with my husband Graham. We have 3 studios in West London, 2 in Chiswick and 1 in Richmond. I've recently started running much more events since lockdown via the Instagram live platform or on webinars, and I'll be holding a lot more of these over the next coming months. So if any of you guys have got any more interesting subjects or topics that you'd like to discuss, then please let me know. So in the meantime, I'm going to introduce Vicky Lawson, who hopefully you can all see at the top of the screen there. And I'm going to let Vicky just briefly introduce herself and tell you a bit about what she is. We all know that she's a health psychologist, and what her speciality is and what she does. So Vicky, over to you. I'm just going to mute myself whilst you speak, okay?
Thanks, Lister. Well, hi everyone and good evening, and thank you very much for coming along. I am really pleased to be here because I love talking about the area I work in. So I work in weight management and eating behaviour. And as Lister says, I'm a health psychologist. So mainly I work for the NHS and I'm principal health psychology at the Maudsley Hospital. And I work with people who are struggling with their eating, but I work with people who are overweight or obese or having trouble around things like binge eating, emotional overeating. And I'm really interested in both what we're eating, but also why we're eating that. So I have also qualifications in nutrition, but I'm interested in not surprisingly, being a health psychologist, I'm interested in the psychology of why we eat what we do, why it's so hard to change our eating habits, why we tend to revert back to certain things, and what are all the different sort of complex factors that lead us to eat in the way we do. And I'm also really interested in how we can manage our relationship with food so it can be what it should be, which is a pleasure and not a source of grief and guilt and distress and regret, which I think, we can sometimes all experience in relation to food. And then, of course, particularly how our emotions play into that. So, about emotional eating and how we can manage our sort of emotional eating. And my background, as I say, I'm a health psychologist. I've worked in weight management for about 15 years now, and I'm working both clinically, as I am at the moment, but I've also worked in research quite a bit at UCL, University College London, in the health behaviour change unit there, and also done some work for Public Health England around physical activity and mental health. So that's me in a nutshell. And I think, Lister, you and I were basically going to have a bit of a chat and see what came up in terms of questions.
Fantastic. So one of the things that I've obviously discussed with you before, Vicky, is what typically are the type of questions that people ask you and what you see kind of regularly in your clinics. And everybody start thinking about some questions now, and please feel free to send them to me directly. You can do that on your Zoom. And I'll start asking some questions to Vicky. But I know, we see a pattern. I mean, being a personal fitness trainer and spending a lot of time with my clients and the rapport that I build up with people over the weeks and the years, people share a lot of information with me. And a lot of our discussions are obviously with according to weight, and food and drinking, particularly during this lockdown period. We probably see most people, my clients have said that they probably gained up to about a stone in weight just during this kind of lockdown period. And one of the things obviously that people have been saying that also that they've been drinking much more. So drinking maybe 2-3 glasses of wine. They wouldn't normally dream of doing that during a normal, say, school night, so to speak, but they are consuming much more alcohol. And then their behaviour then to kind of, so they overindulge, they'll have like 3-4 days of binging, eating, drinking, and then to kind of compensate for the next day, they'll refrain from any type of eating at all. So they'll miss out on their breakfast, they'll miss out on their lunch, and then often actually they'll turn up at a session of mine and having not eaten or drunk anything at all. and then they're kind of lightheaded and they have to stop doing the exercise. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts were on that. I'm sure there's quite a few people that are nodding their head now, thinking, oh God, that's me. You know, I've done that before. What is that a typical question that you would probably hear from a client?
Yeah, I mean, it's a typical question, and I think it's typical experience. When I started training as a health psychologist and learning more about this area, this is one of the first things that really sort of struck me as a aha moment, because I've been a lifelong dieter and come from a family of very overweight people, and had always struggled with my weight as a child and as a teenager. And then I started training as a health psychologist, and one of the things I started learning about was the role of restriction, because, you know, the common sense sort of says that, I'm sorry, I've just noticed that the screen's gone.
Okay.
But we've got...
Can you still see me?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, Karen came up, I think, because she wasn't on mute. So, yeah, so, you know, I think it's typical, you know, we overindulge and we think, well, the common sense thing to do is therefore to not eat very much the next day, or try not to eat very much the next day. But the problem with that is it leads to really unhelpful patterns. I mean, well, number one, you end up feeling really rotten. You feel lightheaded, you feel irritable, you don't feel very well, because your body needs food. But the other real problem with it is it doesn't actually help, because for most people, what will then happen is they will then overeat, and it just becomes this vicious cycle. So we have a typical pattern I would see with people, and I can identify this myself as well, is that you overindulge, you think, right, I'm going to skip breakfast and lunch because I'm going to make up the calories that I've overeaten. So maybe it comes around 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you haven't eaten, and our bodies just take over. I mean, we are animals after all, and a basic drive that we have is we need to eat. And so at some point, however good we are at restricting, for most people, they will then start eating. And the trouble is, when we then start eating, it's very hard to eat in a controlled way, because we're using the old part of our brain, our survival mechanism is kicked in. So all our sort of good intentions and our sort of cognitive faculties about, well, I'm going to eat 5 a day, and I'm going to get plenty of water, and I'm going to get a good mix of foods. No, basically you would eat anything, and particularly if it was high fat and high sugar. And so the whole cycle then starts again. So then overindulgence is very likely to happen. You start eating 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you think, gosh, I haven't eaten all day, I'm absolutely starving, I'm going to have a big dinner. And there's that sort of sense of restriction and denial is still often in the air. And it leads to a very similar evening, to exactly the sort of evening you're trying to prevent. And then the next morning, guess what? You wake up, you feel rubbish, you feel like I've let myself down, I've done it again, and the whole cycle starts again. So what's really important is to try and find ways of breaking that cycle. I mean, there are sort of exceptions to that cycle, and the obvious one, and some of you guys might be thinking this as well, is, you know, when we see people with anorexia, their ability to restrict has gone above and beyond what most of us do. So I'm not talking about people who've got a sort of clinical eating disorder at that end of the scale. I'm much more talking about general overeating or a bit of binge eating, that type of thing. So it's really important to sort of do things like get into regular eating habits, you know, try not to skip meals. I mean, if I was working with someone, I would be saying to them usually no more than a 4-hour gap whilst awake between eating, particularly if this sort of pattern is happening. Really important that the old part of the brain, the survival mechanism, is not feeling threatened and going, right, I need to, you know, if there's an opportunity to eat, I now need to eat because we're in survival mode, there's a famine, I need to do something about this. I think that's sort of like what I see a lot of.
So I suppose if you've left a gap of maybe 6-7 hours, and I'm kind of guilty of this as well from when I'm teaching, and I think, oh, can't stand there and eat a big meal whilst I'm teaching. I've booked clients back to back 5, 6, 7 hours. You know, I'm starving, and then I've kind of grabbed a hot chocolate or a chocolate energy bar or something like that, and then I've kind of skipped a meal almost. I'm very good at skipping, you know, the lunchtime period. I could kind of not eat lunch at all, but by the time I've got to kind of 4:30, 5 o'clock, I'm absolutely starving and kind of, you know, shaking like that. And of course it's too early to start cooking a meal, and then you know, then it takes half an hour or something like that to prepare a healthy meal. So I'm standing at the, you know, at the table kind of eating crackers with cheese or peanut butter or something like that, and then my meal again, you know, an hour or so later. So, you know, I suppose I'm guilty of having those long periods of time in between, and, you know, it's the what do you snack? You know, when you are hungry in between, if you can't get to your kind of decent main meal every 4 hours, then, you know, do you have things that you would suggest that were good, easy things to snack on for people that would go, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I'm sort of talking about eating every 4 hours, I'm not talking about eating a meal every 4 hours. I don't want anyone to go away thinking, right, every 4 hours I'm going to have a full meal, preferably with at least 2 courses. No, far from it. I'm thinking the very sort of old-fashioned pattern of 3 meals a day with a snack mid-morning and a snack mid-afternoon. Ideally, if you have enough control over your environment to do that. But I mean, certainly in terms of snacks, one of the advantages of snacks is we can get a lot of diversity into our food through our snacking. And we know that as much as anything else, it's the quality of our diets that's really important. And so diversity in our diet is really important. This whole idea, you know, when it comes to things like fruit and veg, eat a rainbow. You know, don't just eat an apple, a banana and a pear of your fruit for the day, you know, every single day. Those are great, but try and mix it up a bit. Really good for getting us a range of nutrients, so getting us a good range of vitamins and minerals and different types of fibre, and also that's really good for our gut microbiome diversity as well, so really good for all of that side of things. So I mean, I think go-to snacks, I'm a bit of a bit keen, I'm in a polite way of putting it, I'm a bit keen on fruit and veg. And I think that one of the problems is we don't eat enough fruit and veg, particularly veg. So if you can shoehorn some vegetables and fruit in, I would say every meal, every snack should include fruit or vegetables. So, you know, typical things, you know, pieces of fruit, bananas already pre-packaged, great, you know, apples, those types of things. Small handfuls of nuts, but being very careful with the small handfuls of nuts, because if you're anything like me, the handfuls get bigger and bigger and bigger, because I love them so much. Those types of things. And actually these days, it's quite easy to get hold of like little pre-packaged snack things. It's always worth looking at the calories and the sort of the sugar and the fat on those and making sure they are, you know, they do what they say on the tin. So if it says it's a protein bar, is it actually a protein bar? Does it contain a decent amount of protein in it? But those types of things I think are really, really helpful. And just having something on you. As I say, you know, a lot of the shops now, you can just nip in and get something small. So having something like that, as you say, otherwise that temptation just to eat sort of cheese and crackers at the counter, and you just sort of, you haven't really, I mean, nothing wrong with cheese and crackers, but it's just, you're not really going to be enjoying them and getting the full sort of, you know, bang for your buck out of those cheese and crackers if you're just wolfing them down because you're starving.
Okay, now I see this a lot in the studios, and I've had many discussions with clients about this, and I see a lot of people removing carbohydrates out of their diet completely. So, and most of them think that by moving carbohydrates, particularly bread, they think that bread is the demon, that actually there's absolutely no way can they have carbohydrates in their diet, because they think that is all to do with the fact that they are bloated and they've gained weight, or they gain weight as a result of having too much carbohydrates. So that I see a lot of people, you know, going on just high protein diets. What's your view on that, Vicky?
Well, I mean, the sort of the national guidance from the NHS on that and from Public Health England is we need carbohydrates in our diet. But all carbohydrates are not created equal. So there's carbohydrates in food, in vegetables and fruits, and those are really, really important parts of our diets for lots of reasons. I mean, they're important for weight management, but they're important, we're becoming more and more aware of it. They're important for longevity. So people, you know, there's been studies done on parts of the world where people live longer, what we call blue zones, and they look at what people in blue zones eat. So these typically people who live to be, you know, in their 90s or plus, in very, very good health. So what are they doing to do that? They're certainly eating carbohydrates, that's for sure. So when we think about carbohydrates, we're talking about fruit and vegetables, absolutely vital. We're also talking about whole grain carbohydrates. So we're not talking about, you know, processed carbohydrates. We're talking about bread with the bits in it. We're talking about potatoes that are boiled in their skin rather than mashed or chipped. We're talking, you know, those are things, and there's lots of information on NHS and Public Health England websites about what unprocessed carbohydrates do. And we desperately need to have carbohydrates in our diet because they also give us fibre, and fibre is really important as well. And they give us energy. and they fill us up. So, our brains alone need 500 calories a day to function. So if we start cutting out carbohydrates, it is really difficult for us to get enough good quality energy into our bodies. Having said that, for some people who really find that low carbohydrate works for them and it doesn't make them miserable or deprived, and it does help reduce some of those things around bloating, that's sort of fair enough. It's not necessarily going to be a case of one size fits all. But I think that, yeah, absolutely, I hear it all the time. People saying, I'm going to cut out bread, like something wrong with bread. Yeah. But there's very different types of bread, and it's also how much bread. So, if you're like a client I've been talking to recently, that if you have a loaf of bread in the house, it will not last the day. Yes, you're going to feel bloated at the end of that day, because if you eat the whole loaf in a day, if you ate that many calories in that quantity, you would feel like that. I'm not suggesting for a moment that's what your client is saying, but it is about the quantity and the quality of what we eat. And it's very easy with bread to eat more bread than we think. And so, and things like, sort of tips around bread, for example, would be, if you're buying pre-packed bread, look at the labels, because they're not all created equal. Some of them are going to be better quality than others. And then I think more generally about carbohydrates and where they fit into things like weight management. I think there's sort of specific cases for things around, somebody's got type 2 diabetes, they might want to talk to their GP, their medical doctor, about reducing the carbohydrates, or talk to a dietitian about that. But I think, as general advice to the general population, making sure that we include a reasonable amount of good quality carbohydrate in our diet is really important. And when researchers looked at different types of diet and put them head to head, so researchers do things called meta-analyses, where they get a whole load of studies done by other people and they number crunch to use those other existing studies, those existing pieces of evidence to find sort of answers to new questions. And there was a study done about 5 years ago, a meta-analysis done about 5 years ago, looking at different diets and which were the most successful in terms of weight management. So is it high fat, high protein? Is it low carbohydrate, high carbohydrate? Is it sort of normal sort of calorie restrictive type diets? And look to see what came out the best by looking at what the best existing evidence was. And what the researchers found was the best diet was the one that worked for you. So if somebody found eating a high protein diet really satisfying, and that meant that they were more able to sort of carry on eating in that way, and it was sort of relatively healthy diet, that's going to do them more good than trying to do something that they find too restrictive and that they can do for like 2 or 3 days, and it's very dramatic. That's not going to be sustainable. So it's actually, although we know what the general advice is for the general population, it's also bearing in mind our own personal needs and what we actually like. And I think we mustn't ignore the role of food preferences. So if you're somebody who loves bread, me, giving up bread would seem like quite a hardship, and also it's a really convenient food to eat, and so I wouldn't know what I was going to do for lunch some days. I think, well, I have to really think about this, and I don't have the time or the energy necessarily to think about that each time, and that's my personal preference. If I wasn't so bothered about it, I could maybe have a different relationship with it. It's always bearing that in mind. Our enjoyment is always really important to bear in mind too, I think.
That's exactly what I think about when I think, when I'm training my clients with their exercise programs as well. Not one size fits all. It's got to be something that, that they enjoy individually. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so now recently, I'm sure you've seen that there are more and more people now that are removing meat and fish and dairy out of their diets as well. So seeing, big increase now in veganism, and, seeing all these plant-based foods on all menus now, even, just high street bakeries and restaurants and people really catering for vegans now. And I just wondered that whether you thought that it was a healthy option to be a vegan, and if it was a healthy option to be a vegan, or should there be supplementing with additional types of calcium or B12 complex, or something to prep up their bulk up their diet to make sure that they were getting everything that they need?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that veganism, like any sort of approach to eating, can be healthy, but it's always the devil's in the detail. So with my vegan clients, I'm always like, there's lots of sort of things that, for example, look at meat substitutes, and actually a lot of the time they can be really low protein. So it might taste like meat and it might look like meat, but it's not got the protein that you would get in, say, tofu, for example. So I think it's being really careful about that. I don't want to sort of name and shame, but things like jackfruit, it really is, it is a vegetable. It doesn't have protein in it. So if we're eating that as our main form of protein, then that's an issue. I think that, that's certainly something sort of worth bearing in mind, is like looking at what we're actually eating and making sure if someone's a vegan that they're actually getting enough protein is really important.
So tofu is a good option for vegans.
Yeah, if they're okay with soya, yeah, that's great. Beans and pulses. Now, I'm a bit of a fan of beans and pulses. Are really, really important for all our diets, actually, regardless. And I think that for most of us, eating more beans and pulses, so chickpeas, lentils, those types of things. If we're wanting to eat lower carbohydrate, not necessarily low carbohydrate, but they can be a really great way of swapping some, traditional carbohydrate like rice or potatoes out of the diet and putting in beans. They're really rich in a whole range of nutrients. They're really high fibre, and so they count as a protein. They count as one of your 5 a day, and they count as a portion of fruit and vegetables, so all in one. So that's the sort of, like, for me, if there's a definition of a superfood, it's a bean or a pulse, to be honest. I think they are very underrated, and of course they're really cheap. They're really versatile, so there's sort of like, which is why they probably don't get enough press, is because they are really cheap. And they're not, they're not particularly glamorous, but they are incredibly useful for our diet. So making sure that the quality of the vegan diet is very good, I think, is really important. And also taking on board your comment, Lister, about supplements. And I think that for many of us, actually taking a supplement isn't a bad idea, unless we're really sure that we're getting enough nutrients to run our body at the optimum level. And I'm not talking about anything particularly fancy necessarily. I'm thinking about a general all-purpose multivitamin and mineral that you can get in Superdrug or Boots or Tesco's. It doesn't have to be anything if people want to look at things that are, different options, that's fine, but it doesn't need to be anything expensive. And that can just be a really helpful way of topping up what we need, because if we're only taking that at the recommended daily amount, we just pee out anything we don't need. We don't want to get into sort of silly things of taking 100 times the recommended daily amount or anything. Just take what it says on the tin, and that's great. And the important thing about that is because the nutrients all interact together. So we need vitamin C to absorb iron and calcium properly, for example. So it's really important that we have a whole range of nutrients. So that's, I think, is my view on supplements. If you don't need them, that's great, but if you're not sure, it can be worth just sort of topping up on that. So I think, generally plant-based is great. You're not going to be surprised to hear me say that, given my views on fruit and vegetables, of which I am evangelical. And I think the other great advantage of eating lots of fruit and veg, and particularly veg, is if you're somebody who likes big portion sizes, which I certainly do. For me, I find it really helpful because it means I can have a lot of food on my plate that's not very calorie dense. So I can have, a big pile of veggies, and it's going to fill me up, and it's going to fill my brain up as well. My brain's going to be quite happy with that, thinking, oh yes, we're having a big portion, and maybe we're not having as much calorie, I'm not having as much calorie dense food as if I had a lot of carbs or other foods on my plate.
So if you are, you can do that in a typical meal. Then, if you do want to have more, like you said, if you've got a bigger appetite, you could have more vegetables then, and that would be fine.
Absolutely. The UK recommendations is 5 a day, but that varies from country to country. In some countries, the actual recommendation is 10 a day is for optimum health. So 5 is, I think, all that the public health system in the UK thought they could get away with, because people would be horrified if we actually said how much we really need. But particularly if you're not preparing them with lots of oils and fats, if you're just preparing them, as they come, eating a lot of fruit and veg is, I mean, within reason. I've worked with somebody who was gaining weight because they were eating 4 punnets of peaches and 3 pineapples and a bunch of bananas every day on top of their normal food. You can't eat that much of it. But certainly eating a sort of a healthy amount of particularly vegetables, but also fruit, really beneficial. And independent of any other sort of health benefit, eating a lot of vegetables and fruit has shown to significantly reduce the risk of bowel cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, all those cancers that are related to sort of inflammatory response and hormone regulation. So, and if people are interested in that, they can go onto the World Cancer Research Fund website. It's a fantastic website. They're doing a lot of research into the links between food and cancer, but also they have very interesting and useful information about veg and fruit generally, if people want us to follow this up. So worth a look at.
Okay, great. Right, finally, I have some questions from some.
Excellent.
Okay, so one person has asked, so how do you stop associating unhealthy food with pleasure?
Oh, what a good question. I love questions like that. Thank you, whoever asked that. I think it's a lot for me when I'm talking to people, and it's a very individual thing, and it's a very individual private conversation that needs to be had, but it's what those associations are. My view is that in some ways, and I think dietitians would throw up their hands, some dietitians I know would throw up their hands in horror at me saying this, I don't actually know if there are any unhealthy foods. I think there's unhealthy amounts of foods, and I think there's unhealthy frequency of foods. So, but that's not the same as unhealthy foods. I mean, we could probably have a whole other sort of 45 minutes on certain foods, things like, palm oil, for example. Let's sort of leave the sort of like the demon foods to one side for a second. But, sort of generally the things that are thought of unhealthy, if we can manage to eat them in a sort of in a way that it means that we can still enjoy them, but we have them occasionally. And I sort of say to my clients, you can eat pretty much whatever you want, but you just can't eat as much of it as you want, as frequently as you want. But the problem about sort of not having those healthy, those what we see as unhealthy foods, is it's that forbidden pleasure thing. So as soon as somebody says to you, oh no, you can't have, someone said to me, oh, you can't have Black Forest Gatto ever again. Boy, would I want Black Forest Gatto. I would be on a mission to find that. But if I know that I can have that, and I can just have that occasionally, and that, the world that we live in, we can get access to any food that we want pretty much any time of the day. So we can get that. And so I think it's really important to sort of look at getting that balance. And so we don't need to disassociate pleasure from unhealthy foods. We just need to monitor how much of it we're having and manage our relationship with it in a different way, so that we actually do get pleasure out of it, and also that we don't feel guilty when we have it, that we actually really enjoy it, and then we just put it to one side and we draw a line under it.
You watch all my clients now having chips for breakfast and coming in for their sessions.
Okay, but they can only do that once a year.
Guys, you heard that.
And I'd want to know how much they enjoyed it.
Exactly. Okay, here's another question. So I've got another 3 questions coming up here. Okay, so as an athlete, I depend on carbohydrates for performance. Would I therefore be looking to cut fats in order to drop weight?
Possibly. I mean, I think, but you also need fats, depending on what fats you're having. I mean, we don't need that much fat, but obviously if you're burning a lot of calories, you're going to need a certain amount of fat, because that's the easiest way to get calories, one of the easiest ways to get calories into the body. So it would be looking at the overall, to drop weight, it would probably be looking at the overall diet rather than a particular food group, and just being quite careful about balancing the calorie needs. And so for somebody who's an athlete and is sort of active at that level, they would really need to sort of sit down with somebody who go through what they're eating, what their sort of food preferences are, where their nutritional requirements are, and then look at what can be taken out in a way that's not going to be at a detriment to athletic performance as well. So just being quite careful about that.
Okay, now this is a question that women ask this all the time, and I'm on this as well. So why during our menstrual cycle do we crave sugar? What is it that just makes us go rah? And I did have a bit of a discussion with the menopause dietitian about this a week ago. So what I think I know what the answer is, but
what did they say? Let's see if I agree.
It's all led by the dip in and crashing hormones that estrogen dependent, progesterone, and that's why we're craving the sugars. And actually, even in the cycle of menopausal health now that I'm in, I find myself also again craving sugar more so. That's a question that I'll ask you in a second about that as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. We get a blood sugar crash. The other thing, of course, is that we might be feeling miserable. We might be feeling depressed. And those are the foods, those high fat, high sugar foods are the things that we will turn to. And we turn to those both out of sort of habit and upbringing and media messaging about, the sort of chocolate ads that we see all the time, which is like associating emotion and food. So there's sort of there's that link going on. But we are really pre-programmed as a species to like high fat, high sugar foods. That is the downside of things. And that's because, 1,000 years ago when food was really scarce, being somebody who liked those foods would have meant that our genetic sort of foremothers and forefathers would have stayed alive. And there's also there's some evidence that there's a genetic link between food preferences, and that some people are much more drawn to those types of foods, and also much more able to override fullness cues, so override satiety cues. So you put those two things together, and particularly in our current food environment, then it's a bit of a time bomb waiting to go off. So I think that, and in terms of how to sort of manage those cravings around menstrual cycles, I think that things like regular eating patterns are really important. Eating foods that have a low glycemic index, which will prevent blood sugars dropping rapidly. So, whole grain carbohydrates, good quality protein. Also, from a psychological point of view, looking after ourselves, knowing that that's going to be on the horizon. And if we have a really strong response to that, we might want to plan what we're going to do at that time so that it's not like, just a sort of, like Cookie Monster type moment and it's finding it very uncontrollable.
I suppose that's the question I was going to ask, next. So in the evening, I've been running around, I've had a really, really busy day. And the thing that gives me the greatest pleasure at the end of any full day is just to have 1 hour in front of the TV, watching a box set episode with just one little treat. That is the one little treat. And I've learned how to not just eat copious amounts of chocolate. I've just stopped that cycle now, and now I find actually just tiny little bit gives me the pleasure. So if I really crave that chocolate or that sugar in the evening, and it seems to be kind of a regular thing each evening, what can I substitute it with if I wanted to if I broke the habit? There's a couple of questions there. So what could I substitute with it first? And should I?
Well, it depends what you like in terms of what you substitute for it. It depends whether you actually, if you wanted to stop doing it, which you might not want to do, and if it feels that something is very in control, you might want to think about not doing it every single time, so it becomes more of a sort of special occasion type thing. So has it just become such a habit that you always do it, and is the pleasure always the same level? And if it's not, then I would sort of say, well, it might be worth thinking about not doing it sometimes. It's always very tricky about sort of substituting one food for another if it's meeting an emotional need, because I think then we can end up going down a bit of a rabbit hole with that. So I might suggest if you wanted to still sort of have the box set hour, which seems perfectly reasonable considering how busy you are and how active you are, to sit down and relax. I don't think I'd be wanting to encourage you to sort of like keep active, Lister, any more than you already are. But it can be, one of the things about breaking habits is thinking about how we disrupt our environment to break our habits. That can be really important. So it might be something as simple as you sit in a different chair. You decide you're not going to do it every night, but you sit in a different chair and, you have a cup of, tea, if you can drink tea, or decaffeinated tea, or, something like that. You could do something like that, but actually trying moving your position. And also, I think always asking when it comes to food, if it feels that it's more a mood route rather than a food route. So a food route, I would say, if you're sort of physiologically hungry, in that case, that's a whole conversation. If it's more of a mood thing, sometimes it's just asking, well, what is it that I want? That I think when it comes to food is it's such an automatic thing that we do. And there's so much sort of said about what to do, about what to eat. You should eat this, you shouldn't eat that, you shouldn't eat carbs, you should eat carbs. And it's all that. But we stop actually asking, well, what am I actually doing with food? What's my relationship with food? Why do I want to eat that? And actually asking, you know, what is it at that moment that you want? What is that chocolate giving you? I think would be the question to ask.
It would apply for somebody who's reaching for a glass of wine or several glasses of wine per night, again, to kind of try and stop the cycle. So if you were working with a patient that was consuming too much alcohol each evening, which I see a lot of with clients.
Yeah, I think this is where sort of getting some extra support around that, to have a conversation. It's not about necessarily sort of 10 sort of do's and don'ts for that. It's very much about, well, what's the person's situation? Why is that happening? And I think a lot of the time, you know, we can see our behaviours that we would like to change. We can see them as symptoms, and actually I see them more as clues. They're telling us something. That's an alarm going off. Someone's coming into me saying, oh, I'm kind of drinking sort of 3 glasses of wine every night, and it's not what I used to do. Or I'm eating, you know, a big bar of chocolate, a whole big bag of crisps, tub of ice cream, and that's after I've had my dinner. If they're doing that, it's like, well, why are you doing that? That's really interesting. So something in your emotional psychological makeup is sending you an alarm call to say, you need to do something different. So rather than necessarily reacting to it as like, you know, this is a terrible fault, I'm so ashamed, I'm so undisciplined. It's more like, what is your body trying to tell you? I think is the question that I'm always interested in asking people.
So I suppose, like you suggested about me sitting down, doing the same thing each evening about giving me pleasure, and changing a seat position and things like that. I really like that suggestion, because it's like changing a complete habit to what you would normally do. And I'll definitely try it this evening. So would you suggest the same thing then for somebody that would be reaching for, you know, a couple of bags of crisps whilst they're waiting for their supper and a glass of wine? So it's now becoming habit forming. How would you kind of suggest for them to kind of break that habit? They come home from work, they've had a stressful day, standing, working in the NHS or something like that, you know, a full on day, and they're waiting for the supper to cook, and they've grabbed a glass of wine and a couple of bags of crisps. And they're doing that now every night. And the glass of wine now is maybe becoming 2 glasses of wine. So how would you suggest to kind of break that type of habit?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to hit pause and realise that you're doing it. That's the absolutely crucial thing. And also that you not that you want to change it, that you need to change it, that it's having some sort of an impact that you're not liking in terms of weight gain, mood, you know, what is going on with that? Is that something you really want to be doing in 6 months' time? What's life going to look like if you're still doing that every night in 6 months' time? And your health is going to suffer as a result, both your physical and possibly your psychological health is going to suffer. So I think it's about sort of thinking about how to break that cycle. Again, and it sounds ridiculous, but actually trying to change the habit around it is really important. So I've had a client recently who was doing exactly that. So would be having bags of crisps whilst preparing dinner, cheese and crackers whilst preparing dinner, and would probably be eating a whole meal's worth of calories beforehand whilst preparing dinner. So one of the first things that I got him to do was to prepare dinner in a different place. And not have some of those things in. So even having those things, or not, you know, even if you can't not have them in the house, have them in a different part of the house. So, and we know that actually changing our food environment is really important. And one of the things that, you know, sort of like a sort of little example of that is if you think about in newsagents, they have those ice cream fridges with the clear tops. The reason why they have them is they didn't used to have the clear tops, but they realised if they put the clear tops, they sell a lot more ice creams, because as people walk past, they see the ice creams. And we're very much like that. It's like, you know, if you have biscuits in the house, don't have them in a clear plastic or glass barrel. Put them in, because if you see them, we're very responsive to that. But the other thing is, things become such a habit. It's about thinking about how to break that habit. And I've got a little funny little test that we can do to sort of do about habits. So I'd ask everybody who's on the call to cross their arms. Just cross your arms how you'd normally cross your arms. And I'd now like you to cross your arms the other way. So the hand that's underneath, I want you to put it on the top, and the underneath hand, I want you to swap it around. How does that feel?
Yeah, it's completely unnatural. And it's the same with crossing your legs as well, or holding your handbag on your shoulder. You can't swap shoulders.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just habits that we've learned over the years for whatever reason. So and that's what changing a habit is like. So you've actually sort of got to learn to cross our legs or our arms in a slightly different way. And so it's about unlearning something we've already done. So it would be about looking at what's going on both psychologically for that person, and also looking about the practical things we can do in that person's environment to change their setup, to try and break that cycle. Because otherwise, so many things that we do are automatic, and habits serve us really, really well. Because quite frankly, we wouldn't get out the door in the morning if we didn't have habits. If every time we brushed our teeth, we had to think, how do I brush my teeth? How do I take the top of the toothpaste? It'd be a nightmare. We wouldn't be able to do it with shoelaces. These are all things that we do automatically. And that's a great skill that we have as humans. But some things that we do automatically and become habitual really don't serve us. And it's looking at how we then unpick those behaviours.
It's about being mindful, isn't it? It's how important being mindful is that comes into play in everyday life.
Absolutely. And how we can make the healthy option the habit as well. So we can be mindful about those things that are unhelpful for us, but then we make the healthy option the mindless option as well. So we don't have to think about it. So we can automatically do that.
Really, really interesting. I've got one last question here. What's your view on DNA testing to help find out what's the suitable diet is DNA wise? Is it worth it?
I don't think we're far enough along. Personally, I don't think from my understanding of the research, I don't think we're far enough along to know that at the moment. I think that we might be, and I think that the things in the nutrition field are changing quite rapidly. So some of the things that we know about the gut microbiome now, 10 years ago, I have to hold my hand up, I was quite sniffy about the whole area. It's like, So you might have me on this call in a year's time or 2 years' time, and I'll be like, oh, absolutely, that's the way to go. And it's just like, but at the moment, the evidence isn't compelling enough to suggest that's the case. I think we're going to learn a lot more about personalised nutrition over the next couple of years, and about how different people respond to the same food in quite different ways. So I think it's more of a case of watch this space. But the other thing I would say about that from a psychological point of view, if somebody would find that helpful, so if you think that would be something that you would find helpful, and you feel that would give you more of a sort of structure to making changes that you want to make, then I think there's also that side of it as well. If that's going to get you interested and engaged in making changes, well, then it might be an option for those reasons, even if we haven't got enough conclusive evidence about the sort of physiological responses.
Really, really interesting. It's been a wealth of information, Vicky, that really has. And I think we've just kind of touched on a lot of subjects there. I'd like to, discuss much more in depth with you, including gut health as well. That's something else that really fascinates me. And I hope everybody else has found it really, really interesting as well. I just would like you to just finish on just telling if anybody's got any questions or they'd like to look you up further. Can you just give a shout out to your website and your book, please, Vicky?
Okay, yeah. I much to Lister's chagrin, I'm not on social media, I'm afraid. I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm a bit scared of it. And also, I justify it to myself by saying, well, I work in the NHS and I think it might be a bit weird for my patients if I was on, social media a lot and all this sort of stuff. But it's really because I'm chicken. But I do have a website, and you're very welcome to contact me through my website. And my website is just vickylawson.net. And as Lister mentioned, I'm a co-author on this book, which I will hold up for you to see, which is Overcoming Weight Problems. And it uses cognitive behavioural therapy to help people change their eating behaviours. And so it's a sort of weight management book that I've written with this amazing dietitian called Claire Grace, who is just a wonderful clinician and wonderful researcher. If you want to sort of find out more about some ideas, some of the things we've touched on, or get in touch with me through my email on my website. I'd be really happy to answer some more questions if I can. Can't promise, but I'm always interested in talking about this stuff. And just want to say thank you so much for letting me come on today and for being such a fantastic host. And thank you all for your really great questions. I really enjoyed being here today. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Vicky. We'll speak soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.